In this video, I'll show you how you can call an Azure function that's been secured by Azure Active Directory from a Power App. In order to do that, you have to create what's called a custom connector. And a custom connector points to your Azure function. So we can look at the one I have here. You'll notice that it's configured to point to an Azure function endpoint. It's configured for OAuth 2.0 and Azure Active Directory. It has a definition that will call an Azure function off of the root endpoint /API/hello. We have a mechanism in which we can test it. So this is already set up to use a connection. And I can just come in here and I can test it. We'll see that we get a response here. The request passes a name with a value, and the response just gives us a string response. And you'll notice here I have a connection that uses the custom connector. And then finally I have a Power App that has a data source pointing to my Azure function. And if I look at the button here, you can see that it sets a variable to the return value of the call to my Azure function after it passes the value of what's in the text box. And then my label will be populated with that variable. So if I run this, and I type test here, it'll call the Azure function passing the value test, and the Azure function just echoes the value with the word hello in front of it. All right, now that you've seen what we're going to build, let's go build it. So before we get started, I want to refer to some documentation which summarizes a lot of what I'm going to be doing in this video. So I'll refer back to this from my blog post, as well as refer back to this documentation at certain times within the walkthrough. However, I'm going to show some ways that the Azure portal with Azure Functions automates some of the steps in this documentation. But if you read this documentation, it basically tells you that you need to create an Azure AD app registration for your API, in this case our Azure Functions, and an Azure AD app registration for your custom connector, and how to configure everything so that you can go then create your custom connector. All right, so let's get started. I already have a Azure Function app, but I haven't created any functions yet. So I'm going to create a very simple function that uses the out-of-the-box HTTP trigger C# template. I'm going to call this hello, and I'm going to give it an authorization level of anonymous. And I'm going to do that for a particular reason. Instead of providing an API key for authentication or authorization, we're going to protect this function with Azure Active Directory. So I'll go ahead and click Create here. And if we test this out and we click Run, what you'll see is that we passed this function URL, an HTTP post, passing it this in the request body, and this is the result that we got. Hello Azure. So if I were to change this to Mark and click Run, we'll get Hello Mark. So as I mentioned, this documentation talks about creating your Azure AD app registration, and then later on configuring your API with that app registration. I'm going to show you how you can do steps 1 and 3 much faster. So I'll come over here, I'll select my function app, I'll click on platform features here, select authentication and authorization, I'll turn on app service authentication. I don't want to allow anonymous, so everything requires Azure Active Directory, and then I'll come in here, I'll select Express, create new AD app, click OK, and then save. And so what you'll notice now is if I come back over here, and I try to execute this function in the test harness, it's going to give me a little error here, unauthorized, which is exactly what's expected. But if I come over here and I paste this, and I say name equals Mark, it's going to prompt me for authentication. And in this case, I'm already logged in as Mark. I just have to consent. And then the function executes and gives me a result. So let's close that. We'll come back over here. Let's check out what happened. So if I come over here and open another tab, go to portal.azure.com, I'll select the Active Directory option down here. I'll select App Registrations. And in fact, it created an app with the same name as my Azure function called dkdtpa func demo. And if I were to look at this and look at all the settings, what you would find is that, again, the steps in 1 and 3 effectively just happened. But the next thing we have to do is what it describes in step 2, which is we have to create an Azure AD app registration for my actual custom connector. And then we can wire all this up. So I'll come back over here. I'll create a new app registration. Let's call it this text right here. So again, create a new app registration. We'll call it demo con for our connector. And this right here can really be anything. So I'll create that. And there's a few things we have to do. So in this case, the documentation is really helpful now. So I'll click on this set. I've already just created the application. The next thing I need to do here is set the redirect URL. And I'll come over here and set that as my reply URL as the instructions say to do. I'll save that. The next thing it says is to add permissions. So this is the app registration for my connector. And so my connector has to be granted permissions to access the actual API for Azure Functions. And so in order for my connector to be able to call the Azure Function API, my connector app registration has to have permission to the API app registration. So what we'll do here is we'll come over, select required permissions, add, select an API, dkdt. Notice my con, which is the one I'm in right now, is grayed out, but the actual dkdt PA func demo, that is the app registration for my actual Azure functions. So I'll select that. And then I need to give it the delegated permissions, which says this app registration, is effectively my connector, which uses this app registration, has delegated permissions to access the API that's governed by the app registration for my Azure function. So I'll click select here, done. All right, the next step is to create an API key for my connector. So we'll come back over, and you can call this whatever you want. I'll call it an API key. And I'll pick never expires, but if you're doing good key rotation, you obviously want an expiration. I'll click save here, click copy, and we'll just hold that over here in Notepad for later use. If you come back to the instructions, that's really all we have to do for step 2. Now remember, step 1 and 3 were already done for us more quickly through the Azure Functions portal. So we're pretty much now ready to come over to PowerApps and use all this configuration. So if we come over to PowerApps, we need to create a custom connector. And that custom connector, we can create in a number of ways, but it's real easy to just create it from blank. I'll call this my AZ funcs. You can really call it whatever you want. And then we need to start using some of the values we have from all the other things we've done. So first, I'm going to come over here. I'm going to copy this. And the host is just going to be the root domain for my Azure function. Security is going to be OAuth 2.0. And then Azure Active Directory. So client ID is going to be from the app registration that we used for our connector. That's this one. So I'll copy this, paste that in, and then the client secret is that secret we generated over here. And again, these are the values for the connector. The resource URL needs to be the client ID for the actual API. So whereas this was the app registration for the connector, this is the app registration for the Azure Function API that we want to call. So we'll grab that. And then we'll continue. Now we need to tell this connector how to call the Azure function. And we do that by creating an action. And I'm just going to call this generically hello to match the name of my Azure function. But this operation ID is what it'll show up as within the Power App. So it's going to be a post. We're going to import from sample. That sample is just our Azure function over here. So I'm going to copy this, paste it here, and then I'm going to copy the sample body of the request. And I'll make sure we've selected post up here, and I'll import that. Okay. So the next thing we need to do is have a default response. So what this is doing is it's telling the connector what the shape of the request and response are, so the Power App can call it. So I'll add a default response. As we saw, that was just a string, so this one's really easy for me. I can really just type anything here. In fact, I could have just typed 2 double quotes. We'll click import here. So validation succeeded. We'll click create connector. Next, we'll go ahead and test our connector. In order to test our connector, we need a connection. Right, so come in here, we'll create one. That creates our connection. So we'll come back to custom connectors. We'll edit this and we'll select test. And just put a value in. We can always do the raw body as well, but it gives us a nice little UI here. And we can click test connection. Now what you'll notice is that you immediately get a 404. And I struggled with this a little bit. The documentation doesn't really explain this. This may be a transient bug, but what I found is the only thing that fixes this is to wait. I don't know how long you have to wait, but what I've done is wait about a half an hour and come back. And then when I test operation again, it all seems to work. So in the interest of time, I'm going to pause the recording and wait a little bit and then come back once this is all working. Okay, so I've waited a little over half an hour. I'll refresh here. We'll go ahead and test this again. And we see that we've got a response. So now let's go ahead and create an app. We'll just take a blank phone layout app. All right, so we want to view our data sources. We'll add one. Go ahead and select the data source. Now it's available in this Power App. So I should be able to now come in here, insert a text box, a button, and a label. Let's clear this out. Clear this out. What we want to do is on select of the button, we want to set a variable. We'll just call this func response. And so we're going to set this variable to the following value, which is my function.hello, so that's the call to the Azure function, setting its name value to text input one dot text, close bracket, close parens, and then our label, we're just going to set its value to func response. Let's go ahead and try this out. So type Mark here, click button, and it says hello Mark. If I change this, again, it calls the Azure function. So again, in this video, we showed you how to secure an Azure function using Azure Active Directory, similar to steps 1 and 3 in this walkthrough, and then create an Azure Active Directory registration for our connector, similar to step 2 here, and then wire it all together to create this connector, the connection, and then let the Power App use it.